March 18th, 2026. I was analyzing the latest energy trade data when I noticed something that made me pause my morning coffee. Saudi Arabia had just completed its largest oil transaction with China, $14.7 billion worth of crude settled entirely in Yuan. No dollars involved, no SWIFT system, no American banks in the middle of the deal. But here's what made this truly historic. This wasn't an exception anymore. It was becoming the rule. Over the past 6 months, 34% of Saudi oil exports to Asia had been settled in alternative currencies. The petrodollar system that had anchored global finance for 53 years was quietly dissolving, one transaction at a time. My colleague Mike, who tracks international payments for a major bank, put it perfectly. It's like watching the foundation of a building crumble in slow motion. Each deal that bypasses the dollar removes another brick. We're still standing, but for how much longer? The numbers told a story that mainstream media wasn't covering. The dollar's share of global trade settlements had fallen from 87% in 2020 to 63% in early 2026. Central bank dollar reserves were at their lowest percentage since 1995. And most telling of all, the countries driving this change weren't America's enemies. They were longtime allies, finally choosing their own economic interests over political loyalty. What I discovered in my research was that we're witnessing the fourth and final phase of a historical pattern that has repeated itself with every reserve currency over the past 500 years. And if history is any guide, this phase ends with complete monetary system transformation. Understanding the four-phase cycle. History shows us that reserve currencies follow predictable life cycle patterns. Understanding these phases explains why the current changes aren't temporary geopolitical tensions. They represent the natural evolution of global monetary systems. Phase 1, Emergence and Growth, 1944 to 1971. A rising power. As currency becomes internationally accepted due to economic strength, military dominance, and trade advantages, the Bretton Woods system established the dollar's dominance when America represented 50% of global GDP and held most of the world's gold reserves. During this phase, other countries voluntarily adopted the dollar because it offered genuine benefits. Stable value, broad acceptance, and backing by the world's strongest economy. Phase 2, Peak Dominance, 1971-2000. The reserve currency achieves maximum international usage, despite losing some of its original backing. When Nixon ended gold convertibility in 1971, the dollar paradoxically became even more dominant through the petrodollar system and America's unmatched economic influence. This phase features widespread international acceptance, while the issuing country begins leveraging its monetary privilege to finance consumption beyond its productive capacity. Phase 3, Overextension and Abuse, 2000-2020. The issuing country uses its currency as a weapon for political objectives, forcing other nations to seek alternatives. The dollar weaponization through sanctions, SWIFT exclusions, and secondary sanctions created the motivation for alternative systems. Countries begin questioning whether the benefits of using the reserve currency outweigh the risks of political and economic control by the issuing nation. Phase 4, Fragmentation and Replacement, 2020-present. Alternative systems reach sufficient scale to handle major international transactions, making the reserve currency optional rather than necessary. We're witnessing this now as China-Russia energy deals, BRICS payment systems, and bilateral trade agreements bypass dollar requirements. The reserve currency does not disappear overnight. It becomes one of several options, rather than the dominant necessity for international trade. The Saudi Arabia pivot, when allies choose economics over politics. The most dramatic evidence of Phase 4 acceleration is Saudi Arabia's systematic pivot away from dollar exclusivity, a change that strikes at the heart of the petrodollar system as foundation. The historical context. The petrodollar system began in 1974 when Henry Kissinger convinced Saudi Arabia to price oil exclusively in dollars and recycle oil revenues through U.S. Treasury bonds. In exchange, America provided military protection and guaranteed the Saudi monarchy's security. For 50 years, this arrangement gave America enormous advantages: automatic demand for dollars, low interest rates on government debt, and the ability to print money without immediate inflationary consequences because dollars flowed overseas. The breaking point. By 2023, Saudi Arabia faced an impossible choice. Continuing dollar exclusivity meant accepting American foreign policy decisions that increasingly conflicted with Saudi regional interests, especially regarding Iran, China, and energy transition policies. The Saudis watched America use financial sanctions against Russia, freeze Afghan central bank reserves, and threaten secondary sanctions against countries that maintained normal business relationships with sanctioned nations. The strategic calculation. Saudi leaders realized that dollar dependence had become a strategic vulnerability rather than an advantage. If America could freeze Russia's reserves and exclude Russian banks from SWIFT over Ukraine, what would prevent similar actions against Saudi Arabia during future policy disagreements? The mathematical reality was stark. China had become Saudi Arabia's largest oil customer, representing 27% of Saudi exports in 2025. Continuing to price Chinese sales exclusively in dollars while China developed alternative payment systems made no economic sense. The implementation. Saudi Arabia's shift away from dollar exclusivity has been gradual but accelerating. 2024. First yuan-denominated oil sales to China, 8% of total Chinese purchases. 2025. Expansion to multiple currencies including euros, yen, and rupees, 22% of total exports. 2026. Alternative currency sales reach 34% of total exports, with projections of 50% by year end. The Saudis haven't abandoned the dollar entirely. They've made it optional. And optionality is exactly what destroys monetary dominance. Historical parallels. Spain and Britain's currency declines. Understanding how previous reserve currencies lost their dominance provides crucial context for recognizing the dollar's current trajectory. The Spanish Real de Ocho, 1580-1650, Spanish silver from American mines created the world's first global currency. The Spanish Piece of Eight was accepted from Manila to London, providing Spain with enormous economic advantages through seigniorage and automatic demand for Spanish currency. Spain's mistake was using monetary privilege to finance imperial overextension rather than productive investment. Military campaigns, bureaucratic expansion, and consumption beyond productive capacity gradually eroded Spain's economic fundamentals, while other nations developed alternative trade relationships. The breaking point came when Dutch and English merchants developed bilateral trading systems that bypassed Spanish currency requirements. Once alternatives existed, Spanish monetary dominance collapsed rapidly as traders chose systems that provided economic benefits without political obligations to Madrid. The British pound sterling, 1815-1944. Britain's currency dominated international trade for over a century due to naval power, industrial leadership, and the gold standard's credibility. The pound was essential for international trade because Britain was the world's workshop and shipping center. Britain's decline began when they started using currency dominance to finance 2 world wars and maintain an empire beyond their economic capacity. The 1967 pound devaluation revealed that sterling's international status had become artificial, maintained through political arrangements rather than economic fundamentals. The transition accelerated when America offered superior economic opportunities and military security without the political complications of supporting Britain's imperial objectives. Countries switched to dollar systems not because they disliked Britain, but because alternatives provided better economic outcomes. The pattern. In both cases, reserve currency decline followed the same progression. Overuse of monetary privilege to finance unsustainable policies, using currency dominance as a tool for political control. Other nations developing alternatives to reduce political dependency. Rapid abandonment once alternatives reached sufficient scale. The dollar is following this exact pattern, with weaponization replacing the economic benefits that originally created international adoption. The mathematics of dollar decline. Current data reveals the mathematical progression of dollar system fragmentation, showing that we're past the tipping point where alternative systems become self-reinforcing. Trade settlement shifts. Dollar usage in international trade settlements has declined from 87% in 2020 to 63% in early 2026. This represents the fastest decline in reserve currency usage in modern history, faster even than the British pound's decline after 1967. The decline isn't gradual, it's accelerating. Monthly data shows dollar usage falling 2.3% quarterly in 2025 compared to 0.8% quarterly in 2023. Central bank reserve changes. Global central bank dollar reserves have fallen from 62% in 2020 to 54% in 2025. More significantly, the composition of reserve accumulation has shifted dramatically. Dollar reserves, net selling of $340 billion in 2025. Gold reserves, net purchases of $89 billion in 2025. Yuan reserves, net additions of $156 billion in 2025. Other currencies, net additions of $95 billion in 2025. Alternative system scale. The critical factor in reserve currency transitions is when alternative systems reach sufficient scale to handle major transactions without the dominant currency. CIPS, Chinese payment system, $12.8 trillion annual volume in 2025. BRICS payment mechanisms, $8.7 trillion annual capability. Bilateral currency swaps, $15.3 trillion total agreements active. Combined alternative capacity, $36.8 trillion, 65% of global trade volume. The network effect reversal, Reserve currencies gain strength through network effects. More users make them more valuable. But once alternatives reach critical mass, network effects reverse as businesses and governments choose systems that provide benefits without political risks. We've reached the reversal point where alternative systems offer sufficient utility that businesses choose them over dollar systems, even when dollars remain available. The weaponization, backfire. America. His use of the dollar as a geopolitical weapon has accelerated Phase 4 by providing compelling reasons for countries to develop alternatives, even allies who had no initial intention of challenging dollar dominance. The sanctions. Proliferation. Since 2018, America has implemented sanctions affecting over 30% of global GDP through targeted restrictions on Russia, Iran, China, Venezuela, Turkey, and dozens of smaller nations. Each sanctions episode demonstrates to other countries that dollar system participation creates political vulnerability. The psychological impact extends far beyond sanctioned countries. Nations like India, Brazil, and Saudi Arabia recognize that policy disagreements with America could result in financial system exclusion that would damage their economies regardless of the merit of their positions. The secondary sanctions. Threat. Perhaps more damaging than direct sanctions is America's use of secondary sanctions that threaten to punish third countries for maintaining normal business relationships with sanctioned nations. When America threatens to sanction European companies for buying Russian energy or Asian banks for processing Iranian transactions, it forces neutral countries to choose between American approval and their own economic interests. The SWIFT weapon. The exclusion of Russian banks from SWIFT in 2022 demonstrated that America could shut countries out of the global financial system over political disputes. While many countries supported Ukraine, the mechanism of exclusion terrified governments worldwide. If America could exclude Russia, a major economy with significant global integration, from international finance, no country was safe from similar treatment during future disagreements. The unintended consequences. Each use of financial weapons provided motivation and justification for alternative system development. Russian exclusion accelerated BRICS payment system development. Iranian sanctions drove Middle Eastern alternative currency. Adoption Chinese technology restrictions motivated Asian financial independence. Secondary sanction threats pushed European alternative payment research. The weaponization strategy succeeded in punishing targeted countries, but failed to consider that punishment mechanisms would motivate systematic alternatives that ultimately weakened the dollar system itself. The multipolar future. Taking shape. The emerging global monetary system is not replacing American dominance with Chinese dominance. It is creating genuine multipolarity where no single currency or country controls international finance. Regional currency zones. Rather than one global reserve currency, we're seeing the development of regional systems. Asian Development Zone, Yuan, Yen, and Rupee, clearing systems for regional trade. European autonomy projects, digital euro and reduced dollar dependency initiatives, Middle Eastern energy systems, bilateral arrangements in local currencies, Latin American integration, regional payment systems reducing dollar needs, African continental systems, Pan-African payment and monetary union development, commodity-backed alternatives. Unlike previous fiat currency competitions, emerging alternatives increasingly feature commodity backing that provides stability independent of any government's fiscal policy. Russian gold-backed ruble systems for energy trade, Chinese silver-backed yuan instruments for manufacturing settlements, Saudi energy-backed rial arrangements for oil transactions, Brazilian agricultural commodity-backed real for food trade, technology-enabled independence. Modern technology allows countries to develop sophisticated financial systems without dependence on American infrastructure. Blockchain-based international settlements, central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, for direct government-to-government trade, satellite-based communications, bypassing Western internet infrastructure, artificial intelligence for trade finance and currency management. The network effect. As more countries join alternative systems, the systems become more useful for everyone, creating self-reinforcing adoption that doesn't require American exclusion, just American option status. Timeline, how Phase 4 completes. Based on historical patterns and current acceleration rates, here's how the dollar's transition from dominance to option status will likely unfold. 2026-2027, the tipping point. Alternative systems reach 50% of global trade capacity while dollar usage falls below. 50% for the first time since 1944. Major oil producers price significant portions of exports in alternative currencies while maintaining dollar options. This phase features continued public support for dollar strength, while private markets increasingly use alternatives for practical efficiency and political risk reduction. 2027 to 2029, the recognition phase. American policymakers and media begin acknowledging dollar system changes as they become too obvious to ignore. Policy responses likely include incentives for dollar usage and possibly restrictions on alternative system adoption. International businesses increasingly plan around multiple currency systems rather than assuming dollar centrality for long-term contracts and strategic planning. 2029 to 2031. The adaptation phase. America adjusts to reduced monetary privilege through fiscal reforms, economic restructuring, and acceptance of multipolar financial reality. The dollar remains important, but no longer dominant or essential for international transactions. Global trade operates through multiple currency systems chosen based on efficiency, political relationships, and economic fundamentals rather than default dollar usage. 2031 plus. The new normal. The multipolar monetary system becomes fully operational with no single currency holding dominant position. International trade, central bank reserves, and commodity pricing utilize multiple systems based on practical considerations rather than political or historical momentum. What this means for everyone. The transition from dollar dominance to multipolar monetary systems affects everyone differently depending on their economic position and geographic location. For Americans, reduced monetary privilege means higher interest rates, reduced ability to finance consumption through money printing, and adjustment to living standards more closely aligned with actual productive capacity rather than financial privilege. However, it also means reduced responsibility for global financial stability and freedom from the political complications that come with maintaining international monetary dominance. For international businesses, multiple currency systems provide more options but require more sophisticated financial management. Companies benefit from reduced political risk and increased flexibility while adapting to more complex international payment systems. For emerging economies, multipolar systems provide access to development financing and trade relationships without political conditions imposed by dominant currency issuers. Countries can pursue economic policies aligned with their national interests rather than external monetary requirements. For global stability, multipolar systems are historically more stable than single currency dominance because they prevent any one country's economic problems from creating global crises. The transition period may feature volatility, but the end result typically provides better systemic stability. The fourth phase isn't ending American prosperity, it's ending American monetary privilege. The difference matters enormously for understanding what's coming and how to adapt effectively. The petrodollar system served its purpose for 53 years. But like all monetary arrangements, it's giving way to systems better suited to current global economic realities. The question isn't whether this transition will happen, it's already happening. The question is how quickly individuals, businesses, and governments adapt to the new multipolar monetary reality. The fourth phase has begun. The old system is unwinding, the new system is emerging. Understanding this transition provides the knowledge needed to navigate successfully through the most significant monetary transformation in generations.